This is Our Voices, Our Legacies, the Medical College of Wisconsin's Oral History Project. Today is January 30th, 2017. I'm Dick Katchke, MCW's Chief Historian, and today we're talking with Dr. Cecilia Hillard. Dr. Hillard is the Associate Dean for Research. She is the founding director of MCW's Neuroscience Research Center, and she is also a professor of pharmacology and toxicology and an alumna of the Medical College of Wisconsin as well.
So, all of those things.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for taking time to talk with us. Let's start back at the beginning. When did you decide that you were interested in a career in science?
Wow. Probably that happened in high school. I had an amazing high school chemistry teacher who just gave myself and one other classmate, interestingly another woman or girl at that stage in our lives, the freedom to do kind of what we wanted to in our chemistry class, and that gave me a lot of reinforcement. It was a lot of fun. We made a lot of mistakes along the way, but it was really a great opportunity. So I went to college thinking that I would be a chemistry major. And I did. I majored in chemistry.
And this was at the University of Virginia,
University
correct?
of Virginia, right. I graduated in January of 1977. And the only thing I knew then was that I didn't want to just be a chemist. As much as I had enjoyed learning about that, it wound up not even really sustaining my interest for the 4 years of college. So I knew that that was probably not a great career. So I came back to Milwaukee, which is where I was from, and started looking for jobs. And it was January. I graduated mid-year, and it was the time affectionately known as the Rust Belt, when Wisconsin was a state in the Rust Belt. It was really very difficult to find jobs. I had a couple of interviews, including one at the Medical College of Wisconsin with Alan Bloom, who was a faculty member in pharmacology. But he called me, or maybe I called him and said, no, you didn't get the position. So I kept on looking, and about a week or two later he called me back and said, if you're still interested, I'd like to hire you for the position. And this was in the pharmacology department, and it was actually working with cannabis-based chemicals and looking at their effects in mice. And it was just, first of all, it opened up a whole field to me that I didn't even know existed, which is the field of pharmacology. And this was the perfect intersection between chemistry and biology for me, because it was all about chemicals, but it was looking at their biologic function.
And what was your position at the time then?
I was a research tech. So I worked for him for about a year and a half. And after about 6 months into that, I decided that I would really like to get my PhD in pharmacology. So I applied and was accepted into the program, and actually became his graduate student in, I think, the fall of 1978, that would be.
So this was shortly after the Medical College of Wisconsin relocated to this campus then, in new facilities.
It was right at that point. So the last things that I did as a research tech for Alan were pack up his lab into boxes and move them out here and unpack them. So, and I purposely waited because, don't tell Alan this, but he wanted me to join his lab, join the graduate program in June, but my salary would have taken a drop of about more than 50%. And I figured if all I'm going to be doing is packing and unpacking boxes, no, I'd rather stay as a tech. So I talked him into letting me continue as a technician until September 1st, kind of get that summer of some extra salary. But yeah, but it was amazing. You know, the comparison between the old Kramer building where we were on the Marquette campus and the new beautiful labs of MCW was remarkable. It was really wonderful.
And again, the research area was also a brand new field for you then too. And is this something then you chose to focus on as a graduate student?
I did. So I did a dissertation in that area, looking at the influence of these cannabinoids, cannabis-based chemicals, on how membrane structure is formed and various proteins that sit in the membrane. And we were kind of after this hypothesis that the cannabinoids didn't have a specific receptor, but they interacted with membrane lipids. It turns out we were wrong. There was a receptor for the cannabinoids, but it wasn't discovered until the early 90s. So we were really pursuing, the modern theory at the time for my dissertation, and it was published, et cetera. I'm not sure many people refer to it anymore, but and it was exciting. It was a wonderful way for me to dip my toes into research.
But isn't part of the research process such that even if your hypothesis doesn't bear out, you still learn something? It's still contributing to the body of knowledge.
Absolutely. And, I tell my students now that there's no shame in disproving your hypothesis. In fact, you should set up a hypothesis. You're supposed to set it up so that it's more likely you're going to disprove it than prove it. And if it's a well-done experiment, a yes and a no are equally valuable. So you're absolutely right. I don't want to say, though, that the cannabinoids didn't do what we thought they did. They did perturb lipid membrane ordering, and, maybe part of sort of what we call their nonspecific effects, but we know now that's probably not how they produce their characteristic effects on the body. Yeah.
Dr. Harold Hardman was the chairman of pharmacology at that time. I take it Dr. Bloom was your advisor. Mm-hmm. Who were some of the other faculty members that you worked with in pharmacology at that point?
Yeah. So one was Dr. Mike Hosko. He was right up the hall from us. He also worked on cannabinoids. He was an electrophysiologist, and as a young tech and graduate student, I was terrified of him because he was kind of gruff and had very high standards. As I got to know him better, because as we get on in the story, we'll find out that I stayed on as a faculty member. And as a co-faculty member, he was a much more accessible individual. But so he was wonderful. Some other people in the department that worked on other things were there was a huge group interested in toxicology. So Jim Fujimoto, who was working on liver and liver toxins. One of my best friends in grad school was in his lab and studying the effects of these phalloidin compounds from mushrooms and how they interfered with the liver. He also worked on opiates and was interested in opiate addiction. And then there was John Leach, who was another very interesting character. He worked on toxicology in fish and P450 enzymes. In fact, I had more seminars about P450s and all of their various subforms and isoforms than I care to remember. But
in fact, our animal facility had a big fish area.
It did, yep. And he had some fish up at the UWM Great Lakes Center, and it's kind of funny. We used to joke because he would tell us he was at the Great Lakes Center, he'd tell the Great Lakes Center he was at MCW. No one could find him. But he was wonderful and great. He would hold court at lunchtime. So back in the Kramer building, there was a small kitchen with a table in it, and everybody would come and eat their bag lunches, and he would just lead the discussion on everything. He had a wonderful set of postdocs, and he's a neat guy. And then, of course, there was Garrett Gross, who was a cardiovascular pharmacologist who was just a wonderful person and wound up being a very important mentor for me as I moved on as a faculty member.
And so you finished your PhD, I believe it was in 1983?
Yep.
And then joined the faculty at that point?
No, I did a postdoc for 2 years. So I stayed on with Alan, but it was nice because I had the opportunity to go away a little bit. So the first experience I had as I went to Denver, Colorado, and worked in the laboratory of a guy named Adrian Harris, who was an expert in studying these lipid rearrangements. So we did a bunch of experiments together. And then a second one that was a bit longer is I went over to England and went to Manchester and worked with a guy named Miles Housley, who was an expert in one of the proteins that sits in the membrane. So So although I was, sort of limiting myself by staying at the same institution, I did have these couple of opportunities to go and study with other faculty members that I felt were really very helpful to me. And then in '85, I joined the faculty as an assistant professor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And at that point, you were able to continue your research studies, though, as well.
Right. So, then I had a bit of a problem because, of course, Alan was in the department and was my mentor, my PhD advisor. And in order to be successful in science, you really have to develop independence. So, so I kind of dropped the whole cannabinoid research area and started a new area studying nicotine. Another drug of abuse, another very interesting compound and not terribly far away from what I was doing, but it was outside of Alan's area. And so I managed to get a couple of early starter grants in that area, followed by NIH funding. So
what does it feel like to get your first NIH grant?
Oh my gosh.
As well as publish your first paper?
So this is a fun story because it involves Garrett Gross. So back in the day, there was something called a first award you could get from NIH, and it was kind of like a little bit of a bonus for early career investigators as we have now. So I applied for a first award, and it turned out that Garrett was on the study panel that was reviewing it. And I don't know why, since he's in cardiovascular and this was a nicotine grant, but he was on the panel that was reviewing it. And he had to be outside the room. But back in those days, you would score the grants by pen and paper on a piece of paper. So when he got back in the room, he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and he saw the scores. And he called me later that day and said, one person scored you a 1 and one person scored I think you're going to get the grant. So I was a little bit already, really hopeful that the news was going to be good. But again, way before email and all this electronic stuff, you had to wait for a piece of paper to come in the mailbox, and you would just be checking and checking every day to find your score. And then, many people had rituals for how you opened that piece of paper to figure out what your score was. So I think I got a 14 back in those days, and which was a very good score, and wound up getting the money. So it's wonderful. I've told many people the best day in your life is when you get the score on the grant and you know you're going to be funded because the clock hasn't started ticking yet. You just know that you're going to get the money and you're going to get started.
And what was your focus with nicotine? What were you looking at?
So I was trying to understand mechanisms of nicotine tolerance. So we know that when somebody smokes cigarettes, you actually become tolerant during the day even. Your first cigarette feels very different from the last cigarette of the day. So no one had really figured out a method that you could explore tolerance in animals. So I was demonstrating tolerance and then trying to find a new way to actually look at it. So had a bunch of publications in that area I think probably expanded into like 1990, 91 or so, that I was between 85 and 91 that I was working in nicotine.
And when did you get your first paper published?
So my first paper was published with Alan as a tech. So my very first paper actually has a different last name because I took my husband's name when I got married. I think it might have been in the early, maybe in 79, 80, something like that, yeah.
How exciting is that?
That was really exciting. Not as exciting as my first paper from my own dissertation work, though, because that one you did the experiments and wrote it up, and
you really owned it.
You owned it, exactly. You lived it. And actually, it's funny because the first paper I wrote as a student got accepted without any criticisms, just as was. And Alan and everybody else that I went around, all puffy that I got my paper said, don't get used to it. And I must say it has never happened again. So they were right. Don't get used to it. So,
as you recall your early years as a faculty member, as you were carving out your own area of research, who were some of the others, both within your department and other departments, that you were able to collaborate with?
So, I collaborated with Alan to some extent, although in many cases the collaboration was do you have this chemical, Alan, and can I have it if you do? Kind of thing. I worked very much in isolation, and I think that that was the more accepted way to do it back in those days. I had, people that I hired that worked for me, but I think the way we do it now is so much better, where there's much more interaction and collaboration. I really didn't have a research mentor per se. It was, certainly there were lots of people who were willing to help me, like Alan, and then when he was hired, Bill Campbell. But there wasn't really anybody that worked directly in nicotine, for example, that could give me advice about where to go.
Well, in fact, at that point, Dr. Carice Havoc, who was in the graduate school, and I believe also had an appointment in pharmacology, was also trying to build a faculty database just because people didn't know who was doing what research.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. There's a guy, Sushil Sarna, who was here and worked in GI, and I had an assay for actually measuring nicotinic, the number of binding sites for nicotine. So we did some studies for him where we took pieces of gut and ground them up and did some experiments. So he somehow found that I was working on nicotine. But you're right, it took a lot of asking people back then, do you know someone who does this?
And with people based at the VA or over in the hospitals, it was a challenge.
It was a challenge. Yeah, it was a challenge. And, this was when there was no internet, nothing digital. If you wanted to find out what was known in the literature, you had to go to the library and look up all of these. They had these giant reference things that you'd look up the word nicotine and would have every paper that had that word in its title. And you'd have to write them all down and run around and check them out and copy the ones you needed to in hard copy. So.
Well, this was also at a time when, as you focused on nicotine and some of the dangers of nicotine, we still allowed smoking. We had ashtrays in the boardroom.
I know. There's a funny picture of Mike Hosko sitting at his e-fizz equipment, twiddling the knobs with a pipe in his mouth. And it was used for a long time in sort of our graduate school advertising till someone said, that might not be the greatest idea to have him. Yeah.
After Dr. Hardman stepped down as the chair of the department, then Dr. Campbell was appointed.
Right.
What were the changes that happened? Was there a change in influence or focus within the department?
Absolutely. So our department had been, it had these people interested in enzymes, like John Leach and his group. And then there were a lot of whole animal physiologists, Garrett and Jim Fujimoto and so forth, who were really doing things at very much what we would call now a system level. And I was somewhere in between. I was really interested in getting into nerve cells and what was going on. And we didn't even have a tissue culture hood in the Department of Pharmacology till Bill Campbell came. So he came with much more of a cellular focus in his work. And one of the first things he did was pay for me to go to Harvard Medical School and learn how to culture neurons from a guy named Joe Coyle who was out there. So I spent a week just learning that and brought that technology back, which was a great addition to my lab ultimately. So he changed it quite a bit. While his interests were in the cardiovascular area, he was also a lipid chemist. And so he was hired, I think, in 1991. And right at the beginning of 1992, so in the late 80s, there was a lot of stuff about how there was a cannabinoid receptor. And I was beginning to think, well, maybe I should move back into cannabinoids, and started doing some preliminary experiments. And then in early 1992, the endogenous ligand for these receptors was identified, and it was a lipid. So he knew how to measure these things, so we actually had a grant together for 15 years to look at the endocannabinoid lipids. So his coming to MCW really completely changed my career focus very much for the better, and got me on a trajectory where we were one of the only labs in the world that could measure these things. So,
was there any problem doing research on cannabinoids at the time when people were concerned that these may be controlled substances.
Yeah.
Any pushback that you ever received?
Not that so much. I mean, it's a regulatory pain because you have to have what's called a Schedule I license to have them. But Alan always had a license, so that was nice. I just sort of piggybacked on his for a long time till eventually he said, you know what, I'm going to get out of this business. You're going to have to get your own license, which I now have done. But the worst thing was that the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is the national NIH agency that focuses on drugs of abuse, just didn't think cannabis was important. So we just really had a hard time getting funding for our studies. And now it's so funny. I think the pendulum has swung way over now that we have so much cannabis use in certain states, and unfortunately there's not been enough research done because of, I think, this squelching that happened. They were just much more interested in the hard drugs, cocaine and heroin, and that's probably correct, but in the meantime we really just stopped understanding the cannabis's effects. So.
As new faculty came on, both in your department as well as other departments, did you start to find that there were other people that you could work with or collaborate with?
There were. So one of the first most successful collaborations I had, other than Bill Campbell, was actually with Dave Harder's lab. So it's one of those experiences where we asked a crazy question but got an answer that was really very interesting. So we were wondering whether or not the cannabinoids might affect calcium channels in cerebral vessels. And they had cerebral vessels set up in their lab, so we started looking at it, and lo and behold, it turns out that the cerebral vessels express the CB1 cannabinoid receptor, and they're the only blood vessels in the body that we have found thus far that do. So we did a lot of experiments together they are doing patch clamping. They taught our lab how to do a stroke model, which we used for quite a while. I wound up getting a grant in that area, so I was kind of working in the cerebral vasculature as a neuroscientist, but it was really exciting. So that was one of the first collaborations.
And his work has been funded almost entirely by the National Institute for Heart, Lung, and Blood Research.
Yeah.
So did that open the door for you to be able to start to look at that as a funding source? Or?
I didn't so much. I sort of stayed, so the grant that we had on stroke was from the Neuroscience Institute. And, I've published, so Bill would get a little interested in endocannabinoids, or I'd help him do some of the receptor stuff that he was interested in. So I have a few cardiovascular papers. Garrett and I did a few collaborative projects together, but I don't feel particularly comfortable in that world. I find it very complicated. So,
in addition to Dr. Harder, were there other faculty members that you started to work with? Or?
So not immediately then, but once kind of the whole endocannabinoid field got rolling, I started collaborating with many, many clinical researchers here. So one of the assays that we were able to develop was an assay in which we could measure the endocannabinoids in blood. And once you can do that, now we can do human studies. So we have been collaborating with many groups on campus who are interested in stress and anxiety and depression and pain, kind of studying a fundamental hypothesis that we and others have, which is that the endocannabinoid system, when it's not active enough, when it's dampened down, can predispose individuals to overreact to stressful situations. And this overreaction can be anything from post-traumatic stress disorder to depression to a hypersensitivity to pain. So we're working with a lot of individuals to measure the endocannabinoids and do some genetic studies throughout the campus. So Terry Drew and Cassini and I have a grant together. She's in surgery. Tom Chilimsky and his wife Gisela Chilimsky and I are looking at functional pain disorders. I have to back up though, another sort of offshoot of everything was looking at a second cannabinoid receptor with Bonnie Diddle, where we were looking at that using multiple sclerosis models. So, yeah. So now there's lots. We just had a symposium a couple of months ago on cannabinoids and endocannabinoid research, where we sort of tried to invite everybody in the MCW Milwaukee area who works in this area, and we had 75 people attending, including some from Madison and Chicago, and they're all people that I've collaborated with or done work for or published with one way or another. So from this little ripple of Alan and I, we've grown a big research area, so it's nice.
Were there individuals at other institutions that you started to work with?
Yeah, so both Marquette and UWM. Marquette's been the most productive, so a guy there who's head of their biomedical sciences department, John Manch, and I started collaborating about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we now have an NIH grant together and are co-mentoring some postdocs and students and so forth. So, yeah.
When you first joined the faculty of MCW in 1985, we, at that point, had only had 5 or 6 women who had ever attained the rank of professor. What was the culture like at that point for women in academia?
It was different, I must say. I mean, I'm not sure I ever felt a lot of overt discrimination or anything like that, but I do remember when Dr. Hardman hired me as a faculty member. First of all, it was without any sort of startup funds at all. I mean, it was just kind of, you can see what you can get out of Alan's lab. And I did come to find out that he had hired a male faculty member about the same time who earned considerably more money than I did. So there was definitely this sort of feeling that as a woman, you didn't need to earn as much because your husband would be earning a salary, et cetera. So those kinds of things were definitely happening. We did have some nice, very, very nice role models in the basic sciences. So Margaret Wong Riley, for one, was just, and continues to be, just a tower in the neuroscience area and has been a wonderful friend and mentor. The other person, when I was a grad student, I took biochemistry, and my small group teacher was Jungja Kim. And so she was a very young faculty member at that point, and so we've stayed very good friends and been. Betty Sue Masters was here.
She was our first female chair.
Yep. So I think I was just at the rising stage. I think the women who had come before me had a much more difficult time. Janice Burke was another one who, she was always great for a
in ophthalmology.
pep talk. Yeah. And you know, if you were feeling down, and she would just tell you, "Oh, shut up and get to work." She wasn't really gonna let anybody whine about anything. But you're right. I think at one point when I was a grad student, I counted like 4 or 5 full professors that were women in the whole entire MCW, clinical basic sciences everywhere. So yeah, I think we've made an awful lot of progress since that time.
In addition to your research, you were also a teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And as you reflect on teaching pharmacology back in the 80s, early 90s, and what we present to our students today, how is the curriculum different?
Yeah, so it's the same in some ways and different in others. So I've actually taught some of the same lectures for all of those years. So, and a couple of them are the basic fundamental sort of, what is a dose of a drug, and how do you calculate how much of a dose to give, and so forth. And of course, those things haven't changed really very much. The way you present them changes a lot because now we do PowerPoints, and you're really trying to get the students much more engaged. Before it was slides or overheads. On the other hand, in some of the more content, so I teach the drugs to treat Parkinson's disease, for example, which is another topic I've done for a long, long time. And there, the drugs have changed quite a bit. And now I don't teach that in the pharmacology course anymore. That's taught in a 4-hour class that also includes clinicians and pathologists who are talking about what the brain looks like inside when you have Parkinson's disease, and what does a patient who has Parkinson's disease look like. So much more collaborative sorts of teaching. Yeah.
Over the years, you've had different graduate students that you've worked with. You've had postdocs. You've had young faculty members. As you look at some of those that you've worked with over the years, who are some of the people that you mentored? And while I'm sure you're proud of them all, who are some of the ones that have stood out in terms of careers that they've created for themselves?
Yeah. There are a couple of very wonderful students that I've had. The first that I should mention is Russ Wilkie. So Russ was an MD, PhD, MSTP student who worked for me as a research tech for a little bit between undergrad and coming to MCW, and wound up doing his PhD in my lab. It was kind of a funny situation because he wanted to study diabetes. He wasn't interested in cannabinoids or nicotine or anything. So I let him study diabetes, and we had a couple of really wonderful papers. He went on actually to do, he worked in Madison where he did both his residency and then did a lot of neuroscience postdoc stuff, and then moved to Marshfield Clinics. And we were always talking about, so he got very interested in metabolic disorder. And we were at that time talking a lot about endocannabinoids because cannabinoids play a big role in feeding behavior and obesity. I said, come on, and he was interested in genetics. Let's try this. So we got a grant together in the endocannabinoids when he was at Marshfield. He then moved back to MCW as a faculty member, was here for a little while. But he's now chairman of medicine at the University of South Dakota. So I'm just super proud of him for many reasons. I'm not sure he works on the cannabinoids anymore, but he was just a fantastic young man. He's son of a Milwaukee cop, just really had an amazing work ethic, and so I'm very, very proud of him. He actually married a tech that he met in my lab too, so that was nice. I feel a little like a grandma for their kids. The second person was another M&D PhD student named Sachin Patel, who worked in my lab more in the 2000s. And he's the one that really got us launched in the direction of the endocannabinoids and stress. So his contributions to my lab were transformative to my lab. He's gone on to have an amazingly successful career of his own. He's now an associate professor of psychiatry at at Vanderbilt University. He was named one of Obama's 100 young scientists or something. It's just amazing. He's gotten many, many awards and is very well funded and does great work. So he's doing great. And then the third that I'm so proud of is actually a kid named Matthew Hill, I belong to a society called the International Cannabinoid Research Society. And we meet once a year in the summertime. It's about somewhere between 200 and 300 members in this group. And we go different places in the world. And this particular year, which I think was 2001, our meeting was in Asilomar in California. And it just so happened that Sachin and a postdoc was in my lab, Dave Rademacher, and I, plus another grad student, Erica Carrier, who, by the way, married Sachin, and they have 2 kids. But we were all at that meeting, and Sachin and Dave roomed with this young kid from Vancouver named Matt Hill. And Matt was an undergraduate at the University of British Columbia, really interested in stress. And he just came there all by himself because he thought cannabinoids must play a role in stress because people smoke marijuana to reduce stress and anxiety. So he and Dave and Sachin happened to room together, and they got all talking about this idea of cannabinoids and stress and buffering. And they sat me down and said, we have a proposal for you. We want to work on this. We want you to help us find the money for it, but we'll do the experiments. And that led to this amazing collaboration where Matt, who did his PhD at UBC, would do all these experiments in his rats, freeze the tissue, either ship them to us or bring them to us. And he would come down and run all these biochemical assays. So between Sachin working here and his models and Matt working there on his models, we really, between the three of us, made an incredible impact on the field in a very quick time. And it really was those guys. I mean, I was, I didn't understand anything except for that I thought, well, these kids are really smart, and I think I'm just going to find the money and get out of the way. That's what I did. And help them write, because they weren't particularly great writers at first. But
What led to your appointment as the director of the Neuroscience Research Center?
so this was done by by Dean Jonathan Ravden in 2010, and it kind of started with he was interviewing for a new dean for the graduate school, and one of the candidates that came through said, well, I'll be dean for of the graduate school if I could also start a neuroscience research center here. And it turned out that this candidate did not take the position, but I think it set in Jonathan's mind that it would be a really good idea to have a neuroscience research center here. At that same time, roughly, I was actually being recruited to take a chair of pharmacology at Rosalind Franklin, just down the road in northern Chicago. So I was interviewing for that job. Bill Campbell got wind of that, basically I told him, and he went to Jonathan and said, is there anything we could do to maybe make it that Cece would stay here? And so Jonathan offered me to start the Neuroscience Research Center. So I said, that sounds fantastic. So I did that and got to have a more interesting career without having to move, which was lovely. So that's what I did.
Well, as you started this center, what were the departments you reached out to? Who were the individuals?
Yeah.
What did you identify as the goals that you wanted in the initial years?
Mm-hmm. So as I went around and met with a lot of people that were neuroscientists and very much influenced by Margaret Wong Riley, honestly, it was clear that there were lots of neuroscience researchers, basic and clinical, at MCW, but they weren't in cohesive groups. It was a very broad and thin group of individuals. So in order to pull us into some kind of a center structure, we had to be inclusive but focused, I felt like, and it was really difficult to think about how we were going to manage this. One thing I did was there was a very bright young faculty member in cell biology, Nishat Gurgis, who I felt had complementary expertise to what I brought to the table. He worked in learning and memory. He was an electrophysiologist. And so I asked him to be the associate director of the NRC, which he agreed to. So his lab and my lab moved down into the new space that we had. And after many, many conversations, we decided that the program we should try to craft would be in the area of synaptic plasticity. So synaptic plasticity is sort of how we learn, how we think, how we remember, why we become addicted, why our brain goes crazy with Parkinson's disease. It's how tightly neurons are communicating with one another. So it felt like a good cohesive topic to pull together.
And there were other pockets
Yep.
in neurology, neurosurgery,
Yep.
just the pioneering work here in fMRI and
Right.
imaging, brain imaging.
Mm-hmm.
So it gave you opportunities to tap into many different departments then, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're still, trying to tap more and more into that. I think we have a nice basic science core of neuroscience researchers who work in synaptic plasticity now. Clearly, the group in neurosurgery with Frank Pintar and the people working in trauma and blast injury and so forth. But you're right, there are pockets in anesthesiology and neurology and then the whole vision group, and we include vision and the retina as part of the brain. And then, of course, there's a Center for Imaging Research where they were pioneers in studying the brain using functional imaging. So we're still quite a diverse group, and it's a work in progress. Is still trying to get us to have more collaborations, but it's coming along very nicely, I think.
It's been said that the brain is the last frontier in medicine. Have you found that this same enthusiasm for neuroscience research exists at other institutions as well? And have you found collaborators, people that want to work with MCW on some of the studies?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so Marquette, in their biomedical sciences department, which is really a group that's teaching undergraduates who are interested in medicine, veterinary, dental types of careers. So they decided that the brain would be what would, or CNS neuroscience research would be what pulled the faculty together into a cohesive group. And they'd have to teach all these other subjects, but that they're researchers. So they have a very nice, strong neuroscience group. The psych department at UWM is also a strong neuroscience research group. So that's just in Milwaukee. Madison has great strengths as well. I don't think there's a strong research university without a strong neuroscience presence. There's some, I think 4 or 5 of the NIH institutes are all about the brain. So addiction, alcoholism, neuroscience, and so on and so forth. So a big chunk of what NIH is spending their money on are diseases that involve the nervous system. Even the National Cancer Institute just had a request for proposals for neuroscientists to start studying cancer, to start thinking about how does the nervous system affect the growth of cancer cells. And that's another very neat collaboration I have now with a young faculty member here, Jennifer Knight, who's very interested in how things like stress in human lives, such as poverty or other stresses and strains of everyday life, might influence the outcome of a cancer diagnosis, for example. So.
Well, and this has also created a lot of opportunities for a lot of interactions between clinicians and basic scientists as well.
Absolutely. Yep. And of course, that's where we can translate our research to the best ability. And those of us in basic science, particularly as a pharmacologist, I would love eventually to play a part in a drug that made its way into human treatment. That's a dream that everyone with my training would have. And we actually have some ideas where we may get to that eventually, which would be wonderful.
When you took the leadership of the Neuroscience Research Center, you also took on, in many respects, administrative roles, too, that are not what basic scientists normally deal with. Suddenly you were thrown into fundraising, and you have an advisory board.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to explain science in terms that donors can understand.
Right.
How did you approach this?
Well, I leaned on how I told my parents what I did for a living, I think if you're a good listener and, you really try to follow, engage somebody and not show off that all these highfalutin words, you can do okay with them. I love interacting with our board. They're just such wonderful, committed people, and it's so, it reinforces that virtually everybody is touched one way or another by a disorder or a dysregulation of the nervous system, and how people are looking to neuroscientists for answers for many of these questions. So it's humbling to some extent and really, really gratifying to feel that there are people out in the community that see us as their partners in trying to solve some of these problems.
One of the honors that you received was MCW's Distinguished Service Award, which is the highest honor for faculty. What was your reaction to receiving this award?
I felt so wonderful about it. And actually, I was nominated by the Women's Faculty Council for that award, which made it feel even more special. MCW, I've worked at MCW since I was 22 years old. This March will be my 40th anniversary of starting here. So it's a huge part of my life, and feeling like the institution thought that I was distinguished and felt that I was worthy of that honor. Felt really, really wonderful. So,
You have recently been named the Associate Dean for Research. You are now collaborating then with Ann Ettinger.
okay.
And so, what is your role in how do you delineate the roles that you take on?
Yeah. So from the very beginning, she and I decided that we didn't want to have me have a portfolio. So although she is a population health researcher and I'm a basic scientist, she didn't want to divide up the office, nor did I, into, well, you can be in charge of the animal stuff and the basic science stuff, and I'll think about everything else. So we really, I'm there to help give her advice and counsel on anything that she's interested in having me work on. I do a little bit of special projects when we're thinking of perhaps we're working right now on setting up a new core. So I'm working on that for her and some other things. So it's been wonderful. She's another fantastic role model as a leader who also happens to be a female. So I've enjoyed working alongside her quite a bit in the Office of Research. And it's been a nice way to leverage, all these years of sort of doing things in the trenches. First of all, to gain a little bit more perspective on all the staff members that are involved in making this engine work, but then also to help bring the perspective of the faculty member to them about, how we are very much affected by the things that they do in that office. So.
We have strong centers, the Neuroscience Research Center. The Cancer Center is going for NCI designation. We have a cardiovascular center. We have the CTSI award that we have received, and the Digestive Disease Center as well. How do these all help create synergy in the Office of Research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think centers are sort of the value added to MCW. In fact, when I took this position, John Corbett, who's chair of Biochem, who had been a center director at his previous job, said, "You have the best job in the school." And I think it's right, because your job is to really foster collaborations and maybe add that little bit of seed money or mentorship or whatever to help somebody kind of get over the hump, to know, when someone says, "I need to know somebody who does this." Having been here for all these years, usually I can come up with a name or at least tell them where to go to find it. So centers are vital, and I love this structure that we have at MCW for this matrixing between a departmental home and a center home for those for whom it's appropriate. For the Office of Research, I think it helps put lots of people out there that know what they're doing and can help advise. I know Jonathan Ravden, again, one of his visions was that any research-intensive faculty member who was in a clinical department should be in a center, mostly so that they could get that research mentorship and everything from the nuts and bolts of how to get a grant application pulled together to more strategic kinds of mentorship. So.
We've talked about Dr. Bloom as someone who really was influential in your career. Who would you identify as those individuals who have been your mentors?
So it all started with Alan, of course, and he's been a fantastic mentor. He's still a faculty member here. And then the other two chairs that I've had, Dr. Hardman to some extent, but more importantly, Garrett Gross, who was actually an interim chair between Dr. Hardman and Dr. Campbell, and actually was chair for me during a very, very difficult time in my career. I actually went up for promotion and was denied at that assistant to associate professor level. And Garrett was interim acting chair of the department and really helped me, just don't worry about it, put it behind you, keep going. And then when Bill came on board, he, of course, revamped the department, make it much more likely that I was going to succeed, and also told me he had confidence in me and gave me the resources I needed. So those three guys are really the ones that kind of got me in the trajectory. I can't not get into this realm, though, without also thinking about my father and mother, particularly my father. So he was really, he's kind of a funny guy because he told me one time he didn't think women should have the right to vote, but that a woman could certainly be president. So he was kind of a, I don't know, he was a strange person, but he always gave me and had belief in me that I could do whatever I wanted to, and in fact, I was told that I was going to be the flower of all these generations of Irishmen who had come over from the potato famine, and I was going to be the one to bring all that hard work to fruition. So kind of a heavy burden to bear, but it also really gave me a lot of confidence in myself and so forth. And then my mom was, you know, sort of the softer side of things and would, you know, always tell me, tomorrow's another day, it's going to be fine, keep on going. So, yeah.
You had the opportunity to be a research technician here, to be a graduate student here, and now as a faculty member, as a leader, how has that impacted how you approach things, having been a staff member, having been a student? Do you find that perhaps you can approach teaching or interactions with others in a different way because you've experienced those two roles?
I think so. I think, and in particular, having the sort of history and background of MCW, I think in many ways, as we were talking earlier about the trajectory and the difference between the MCW of 1977 and the MCW of today in the research world is just absolutely night and day. And I think, you know, where sometimes you hear a little grumbling about, oh, this or that, we don't have this hotshot latest technique that we can do. You know, I remember the days when, you know, it was really, there wasn't much of anything around. And so I think that has given me a lot of perspective on how fantastic MCW is and how far we have come.
Well,
in
it's
a
funny,
short
you've
period of time.
segued into my next question, which has been, what has changed over the years? You know,
What hasn't changed? So we're in a different place. Of course, even that basic science building has now been added on and added on. All the red and yellow and orange cabinets are gone and been replaced. So it's, you know, I think at its core, it's still Milwaukee, Midwest, wonderful place, and still is full of people that I think are fantastic individuals. So that has stayed the same, but everything else has changed a tremendous amount.
well, one of the changes has been the creation of a school of pharmacy. And how does that impact the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, and what do you see as the opportunities of having a school of pharmacy here to you know, complement the graduate school and the medical school?
Yeah, so as far as pharmacology goes, it's wonderful because these are colleagues. Some of them will be pharmacologists, but even beyond that, medicinal chemists and people that understand how drugs are handled by the body, that study pharmacokinetics, pharmacogenetics, is very enriching for our programs and for our teaching. So there's that. I also think it's, you know, of course, it's moving us towards this medical sciences university status where we're going to grow and become more diverse. And the diversity in clinical care and so forth is wonderful, but of course in my heart, the diversity in research and the kinds of questions that we're going to be able to ask and answer is really very exciting to see as we go forward. Now, the poor faculty in the School of Pharmacy have a lot of work to do in creating a curriculum, so we can't expect them to also become our research colleagues overnight. I know that's going to take a little time, but I'm very excited from that perspective. And then all the other neat things about, you know, co-training med students and pharmacists side by side. Certainly, there may be some opportunities for our graduate students to work in the labs of these faculty members as well. So yeah, it's all good.
As you reflect on your career, what are you proudest of? What are the contributions that you've made that you feel are the most important?
I think I'm most proud of my role as mentor, and the mentorship that I've been able to do for these grad students that we talked about before, and there have been multiple others who we should go through all of them because I feel like I'm going to offend somebody if they see this, but you know, that's fantastic. It's the same sort of feeling as being a parent, that you know you're passing on to the next generation what you've learned. So that I love. And now my mentorship role, because of being director of the Neuroscience Center, gets to be more for young faculty members, and that's been very, very satisfying. I love having people say to me, it's wonderful to see a female faculty member who's been able to have 4 children and also do this job, because that gives me reason to believe that I can do it as well. So, and I love that we've contributed to the literature about the endocannabinoids and stress, and that you know we may be on our way to getting a drug out there.
Well, Dr. Hillard, I want to thank you for all that you've done to advance research as well as teaching, and the mentorship that you've provided here at the Medical College of Wisconsin.
Well, you're very welcome. Thanks a lot for inviting me to chat with you.